Welcome to the Nicole Osei Report. I'm Nicole Osei, and I am honored to be joined by my first guest, SMU political science professor and author, Cal Jillson. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
You were my last guest on the show that I used to host, and we were breaking down the November 2024 election. And the last question that I asked you is, what can we expect from a second Trump presidency? And one of the things that you mentioned was a bit of chaos. And that's what we're seeing right now. So President Trump's efforts to reduce the federal workforce, cracking down on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and even in some cases making threats against private businesses, and the freezing of federal funding that had already been allocated has been met with swift backlash. And there are dozens of lawsuits moving their way through the courts. So I want to start there. What are the possibilities of any of these efforts actually sticking, because we're basically seeing Project 2025 play out in real time? And what could be the cost politically for both Trump and the Republican Party?
Yeah, I may well have anticipated some chaos early in Trump's second term, but I did not anticipate the breadth and depth of this chaos. He has, on the basis of advice he got from some of his political advisors, tried to flood the zone to do a great many things very, very quickly so that opponents wouldn't have one of his initiatives to focus on and try to block, because there were so many initiatives. And so we've seen something like 6 court cases so far, and Trump's opponents have won a stay in a few of those, slowed him down a little bit, but there are other processes ongoing that are dismantling USAID. The education department seems to be in his sights. So the question is whether or not his firing so many federal workers and shutting down so many programs might hit some of his own constituents, like farmers in the Midwest, who voted in very large numbers for Trump, who now see their subsidies stalled. And they need those to keep their farming operations going. And there are just a great many people in the federal government who lose their jobs. They stop spending money in local communities, then other people lose their jobs. And some of those people were Trump supporters. And so we'll see how they react to this level of chaos in the administration.
And actually, we are starting to see glimpses of that. There are a lot of Republicans that are going back to their constituents, and we're seeing basically just eruptions breaking out at the town halls. They are saying, I remember one lady said something like, you've abdicated your duties. You're not doing what we elected you to do. So at this point, I know that, with any party, people are going to toe the line. Do you see any kind of pushback at this stage from different elected officials, maybe now that they're seeing, okay, I may not get reelected, I could lose my seat?
Yeah. This is very much like the Democrat meetings with their constituents back after 2010, 2011, the rise of the Tea Party, when Democrats were taken aback by their constituents coming out against Obamacare and programs like that. And that presaged real Democrat difficulties in subsequent elections. And that may well happen to Republicans here. I think that there have been a number of Republicans, mostly in the Senate, who've pushed back against the speed of some of these Trump cuts. But the other two places that he needs to worry about, the Republican Party needs to worry about, is in the courts. Should the United States Supreme Court decide that certain of his initiatives, like his attempt to shut down birthright citizenship, are unconstitutional, that would be a blow that everyone would hear about and know about. Public opinion is another thing that Donald Trump watches very closely. In his first term, he was never above 50% approval rating. He was for a couple of weeks early in the second term. He's now down back around 45 approval and 51 or 2 disapproval. And the markets over the last week have dropped 4 or 5 percentage points. Altogether, they're down again today. Trump watches the markets very closely and sees them as something of a referendum on how he's doing. So public opinion in the markets, he cares a lot about.
One thing, and I want to switch over to his vice president for a minute here. There was something that he tweeted earlier this month that I found very alarming. And he basically said something to the effect of, quote, "Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power." And a lot of attorneys pushed back against that immediately, saying that, he's a Yale law graduate, that these are things that are constitutionally based in our court system. What do you make of this effort to kind of, it seems like, separate Trump's office from the checks and balances that are put into place and kind of making him almost above the law, so to speak? What do you make of that effort?
J.D. Vance was a little bit careful in that he said the legitimate powers of the executive. And he's right there, although the courts could call a timeout in order to assess whether some exercise of power is legitimate. And if it is, then J.D. Vance would be right. But the reason that people reacted to that is deep in American history, early in the country's history, before Marbury versus Madison, where the Supreme Court took to itself the final decision on what is and is not constitutional. Thomas Jefferson had what's called the departmental view of constitutional assessment. And Jefferson said that the president should be able to assess his powers and make conclusions about those powers. Congress should assess it. The court should assess it. The courts are not the only one who can assess constitutionality. But Chief Justice John Marshall in Marbury versus Madison in 1803 said, that's not right. We are the natural body to assess law, and Constitution is just higher law. So it's up to us, not to you, Tom. And so what J.D. Vance was reflecting was a long-standing sense that the executive is under the presidency. And the first line of Article 2 of the Constitution says effectively all executive power lies with the president. But historically, we've developed independent agencies like the Fed and others that are meant to be separate from the president's guidance. And so he is now pushing back against that idea, saying that I should really have more control over these independent agencies. Independent agencies are unconstitutional, not my control over them. So that's why people wonder whether we're approaching a constitutional crisis when the traditional ways of assessing what the Constitution permits is up for grabs, is in dispute.
And speaking of different agencies, I want to get over to the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, as everyone calls it, because for a while, it seemed like Elon Musk was over it. They really didn't say who was the administrator. And I believe they just said that it was a woman named Amy Gleason, and that Musk is a senior advisor to the president and a senior advisor at DOGE. And they've claimed, the government's claimed, that it saved $65 billion in federal funding, but there's really been no evidence of that. And there's been multiple reporting that there's not been a lot of savings. And although a lot of people could agree that we don't want government waste, what's been your opinion of the rollout of DOGE and the way that they've been handling? Because it just seems like it's been very haphazard in terms of the way that they are just firing. It seems like there should have maybe been a study first of something. What do you make of that?
Yeah, many presidents, including Bill Clinton, during his 8 years as president, undertook major studies for the bureaucracy in order to streamline it and make it more efficient. So there's nothing at all wrong with the general exercise of assessing how the federal government is doing and whether it's spending its money appropriately. But we saw Musk in front of the cabinet yesterday. And some of the cabinet officials have been pushing back against him because they have been nominated by the president. They've been vetted by and approved by the Senate, and they're supposed to be in charge of their aspect of the federal bureaucracy. And so they want to be the ones doing the assessment and lining up any cuts that need to be made. And many of them believe that cuts should be made. So there's a bit of a struggle between Elon Musk, who's very closely supported by Donald Trump, and some of Trump's appointees in the cabinet. And because Trump has moved so early, so fast, and with such a sledgehammer approach, he's done a lot. But what it all adds up to is still very unclear in terms of whether the right people are being fired, because some are being hired back immediately because what they were doing was very important. And he doesn't really understand what federal grants are. Federal grants often are capped. You can spend up to a certain amount. You're not supposed to go near that cap. And so when you say you save the cap amount, really that was going to cost half of it. And some of the contracts had already been canceled that he counted. So it's very difficult to see at this point. But what we do know is that so long as the federal workforce is around the water cooler talking about how long they will have their jobs, they're not doing their work in the way the American public expects them to, and knows that they benefit by it. So I get Social Security every month. I look for that check to come. I celebrate every time it shows up. Other people get Medicaid. Other people get crop support programs if they're farmers. Unemployment compensation is a joint federal state program. Those are critical to people. And when you throw the cards up in the air and say, all right, half of you are out of here by the end of the day, that work is not getting done or not getting done well.
And one other thing that I personally found alarming about DOGE when we were learning more about who was working there. And I believe the last thing I read is I don't believe they had any security clearances, but they have a lot of access to sensitive data. And there's not really, Musk has said that they're being transparent. It doesn't really seem that way in terms of who these people are, how deeply they were vetted. And we really don't know what could be done with that information. I think that's something that a lot of Americans need to pay attention to and be worried about, rightfully so. What do you think about that?
Yeah. I've taught college for the last 45 years. And so the world has been 18, 19, 20 years old all my life. And a lot of these DOGE employees are young, high-tech employees of some of Trump's companies and people who have similar backgrounds. And they're going in to the major bureaucracies of the federal government and being allowed into their programs, some of which, like in the IRS, has a tremendous amount of deeply personal information about Americans. And the Department of Education, for example, and the student loan programs. Who has student loans, how much they owe, are they up to date? All that stuff is in those computer files. And so we've got young people that we don't know very much about, whose security background we know nothing about, penetrating these sensitive government programs. And so people worry a lot about the kids that are doing this. They also worry about Elon Musk because he's got tens of billions of dollars in federal government contracts for Tesla, for SpaceX, for the Boring Company, for X. And he's going into some of these government entities and departments that oversee some of his operations. And so there is at least the prospect of double dealing that no one is really watching out for. And Trump tells us that Elon Musk himself is being very careful about not stepping over any ethical boundaries. I'm not convinced at this point
I'm not either.
That is anywhere near true.
Yeah, I'm not either. And maybe there are rumblings. I'm not in those circles, so I don't know, but I was surprised I'm not hearing more from other businesses that compete for those contracts that are saying, wait a minute, that's a direct conflict of interest because I may go out for that contract and the person that is my competitor has some type of oversight power. I'm shocked that I'm not hearing more rumblings from that community.
Yeah, yeah. The Silicon Valley high-tech community has read the election results, and in large measure, although they've supported Democrats in the past, they have rolled in behind Donald Trump. And the people that might compete with Elon Musk for federal government contracts don't know how long Musk is going to be Trump's principal lieutenant. Mm-hmm. And as long as they see Elon Musk standing up in front of the cabinet and speaking to the delight of Donald Trump about what he's doing, they are going to be very reluctant to criticize anything that's going on, because if Musk remains a principal lieutenant of the president, and they have been complaining, it's game over for them.
One of the last things I wanted to talk about was foreign policy, because we've seen I feel like we saw a little bit of this in the first Trump administration, where he was very antagonistic toward our allies and cozying up to Putin. And this time it seems like it's in a bit of overdrive. So we've seen, Trump going after our allies in the forms of tariffs, and even taking an odd stance on Ukraine, calling Zelensky a dictator and not really acknowledging that Russia is the aggressor in that war. So I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on that, and what kind of cost could that have for Trump politically, but also for the U.S. and our standing on the world stage, now that we've kind of done a flip-flop on where our alliances lie?
Yeah, this has been a tremendous change of America's post-World War II stance in the world. After World War II, we built all of those international institutions, the UN, the World Bank, the Global Agreement on Trade, NATO, all of those were built by the United States. And we took leadership positions in those institutions and paid much of the freight, much of the cost of them. And they've organized the world, particularly Western Europe and North America, as close allies for the last 70, 75 years. And Trump just overthrew that within the last 10 days by stepping away from Ukraine, which was a democracy invaded by a totalitarian Russian government and Vladimir Putin. And in the UN just yesterday stood with Putin and China against Britain, France, Canada, and a number of our other allies in refusing to say that Russia was the aggressor in attacking Ukraine. So whether that is Trump's permanent position or not, I think very much remains to be seen. But for me, this is turning the Good Samaritan parable on its head. That story people remember is a traveler from Jerusalem to Jericho was fallen upon by thieves, beaten and left near dead on the side of the road. And the Good Samaritan stopped to help him, took him, got him care. We have decided to join the robbers rather than to play Good Samaritan any longer. So we forced Ukraine and Zelensky to sign a document giving us half of their rare earth minerals in the coming decades. That is horrific, to take a country that has been attacked and is down and near losing an election and rifling through their pockets for the last bit of change that they might have. So our position in the world is one that no one can depend upon. Britain can't, France can't, Taiwan can't, no one can, because no one knows where we are.
I know, and I'm worried that we could essentially isolate ourselves, because we don't know what could happen in the future, and we're going to need our allies at some point. I just wonder, is that the goal of this administration? I know they say America first policies, but these types of steps could leave us in the dark.
Yeah. Donald Trump believes that all of these international organizations that we've been talking about have been free riding on American taxpayer support for these institutions, and they need to spend more in their own defense. All of that is true. Europe has an economy that is about the same size, same number of people as the United States. Russia is 1/10 the size of the European Union and the United States, and together we're 20 times the Russian economy size. And so there's no reason in the world that the Europeans can't develop a coherent strategy to stand up to Putin, except that they are a coalition of 32 nations against Russia, which is obviously a single nation driven by Vladimir Putin. So we should demand that the Europeans pay more, but we should continue to lead an alliance of the Western democracies against totalitarian countries like Russia and China, Iran, North Korea, rather than voting with them in the United Nations against our traditional allies. So hopefully Trump is again bargaining, but right now everyone is deeply confused. And if I was a political leader in Taiwan, I would not know what to think or what to do.
Exactly. And I'm going to wrap it up with this because I asked you this again on the last show that I had. And I know that you don't have a crystal ball. We can't, we're only in March, well, about to be in March, very early on in this administration. And I'm sure that Democrats are getting their strategies ready for the midterm elections that are coming up. What do they need to do to kind of, I don't want to say capitalize on this moment, but because of all the chaos, and there are a lot of people are voicing their displeasure. What do they need to do to speak to voters about how we can kind of course correct and
Democrats are engaged in a conversation right now about exactly that question. Some Democrats believe, rightly enough, that you just stand back and let the Republicans faceplant over shutting down the government, over inability to pass a budget, over reaction to what they're doing in the federal bureaucracy. While other Democrats think that there needs to be a message correction that puts the Democrats more in the traditional position of speaking for the working class, for the guts of the country, and not so much for the elites, whether those are, academic elites like myself, economic elites on Wall Street, other people who are comfortable, but return to their roots of the Roosevelt Democratic Party. Whichever course they take, they will very likely win control of the House of Representatives in the 2026 elections, because the out party almost always picks up seats.
That's true.
In the first midterm, and the Republicans have very small majorities. So I am quite willing to bet that Democrats take the House. They will not take the Senate, simply because of the number of Senate seats are up and the fact that they're mostly in red states, and there's some Democrats that are leaving the Senate, and open seats are always more competitive. So after 2026, Democrats will hold the House and be better able to check the Republicans, because they won't pass Republican bills through the House. But between now and then, we have 23 months in which the Republicans will narrowly control the government. And the question is whether or not some of those Republicans grow a spine, particularly in the Senate, around the question of Ukraine and whether we should be lining up behind Putin and Russia. And there are some people who like to think of themselves as good men and women in the Senate who will be tested. And they may meet that test. We'll see. They may not. But they will be tested.